Have you ever had to confront someone who tried to destroy you, knowing that a moment of weakness could cost you not only your credibility, but also the safety and future of someone you love? Because for Emma Carson, walking through those double oak doors of the county courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock on a Friday morning wasn't just about testifying in a criminal case. It was about a complete transformation from who she had been 3 months ago, an ordinary nurse returning home after a night shift, to who she had become, a woman who had survived kidnapping and near execution, who had developed love amidst impossible trauma, and who now had to prove to a room full of strangers that her strength was real and not a product of coercion or psychological dependence. Emma entered that room, not as a frightened victim whom Vincent Castellano clearly hoped to break through intimidation by expensive lawyers and physical presence just 15 feet away, but as a woman who had made the conscious and deliberate decision that silence was more dangerous than speaking. That allowing the man responsible for ordering her kidnapping to escape justice through legal technicalities was a betrayal not only of herself, but of the entire journey she had undertaken to reach that point. And when she finally sat in the witness chair after swearing to tell the truth, her hands still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally doing this, of actively fighting instead of just surviving, Emma looked directly at Castellano. She didn't look away. She didn't allow his presence to intimidate her into silent submission. She looked at the man who had ordered her death with eyes that clearly said, "You tried to destroy me, and you failed. And now I will use every ounce of strength I discovered through that survival to ensure you pay for your crimes." Castellano sat at the defense table, surrounded by 3 lawyers, in suits that probably cost more than Emma earned in 6 months. All with expressions that conveyed confidence that their motion to disqualify her testimony would be successful. And Castellano himself had that barely perceptible smile, not obvious enough for the jury to notice, but clear enough for Emma to see, that said he thought he was going to win. That he thought his lawyers would break her credibility until her testimony was deemed unreliable. But Emma sensed Jake's presence behind her. Not physically in the room, because he had been legally barred from attending due to an obvious conflict of interest. He was both a potential witness and the subject of a related criminal investigation, so his presence would have complicated proceedings in ways that even his lawyer couldn't circumvent. But energetically, spiritually, Emma could feel Jake there as a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in facing this. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about Emma testifying against a criminal. It was about a woman discovering that the strength Jake had seen in her 4 weeks of strength she herself hadn't fully recognized was real and could be accessed even when terrified, even when facing lawyers trained to destroy witnesses, even when the man who had ordered her execution was sitting 15 feet away watching every word that came out of her mouth. Emma could feel Jake's presence as an emotional anchor that kept her centered. She could hear his voice in her mind saying things he had said. During 3 days of intensive preparation, "You're stronger than you know. Emma, you've survived worse than a lawyer's words can. Just speak your truth and let truth do its work." She could feel that absolute confidence Jake had in her, that certainty that she had exactly what she needed to face the test ahead. And Emma needed that anchor, because she knew she had been warned repeatedly by prosecutor Sandra Chen during preparation sessions that Castellano's lawyers weren't going to attack the kidnapping facts directly. The physical evidence was too strong: marks on her wrists, medical reports, 3 men in custody or dead who corroborated her story. Instead, they were going to attack her credibility through her relationship with Jake, suggesting she was a compromised witness motivated by distorted loyalty rather than objective truth. 72 hours had passed since Jake received a formal plea deal offer from prosecutor Chen. 72 hours that had been filled with intense and sometimes painful conversations about accepting a guaranteed 3-year prison sentence versus risking a trial that could result in a complete acquittal or a much longer sentence. 72 hours of weighing not just tactical probabilities, but deeper questions about who they wanted to be as a couple. About whether the principle of fighting for justice was worth the increased risk. And at the end of those 72 hours, Jake and Emma had come to the decision to postpone their final choice. Until after this hearing, until after Emma testified about the nature of their relationship under the hostile scrutiny of Castellano's lawyers, until they saw how the jury reacted, how questions attacked, how much strength Emma really had when tested publicly, instead of just in private preparation sessions with friendly lawyers. Because if Emma crumbled under cross-examination, if her credibility was destroyed in ways that harmed not only the case against Castellano, but also Jake's potential defense, then accepting a plea deal began to seem wiser. But if Emma proved to be a strong witness, who could defend the truth even under attack, then perhaps, just perhaps, risking Jake's trial made sense, because the jury would see strength of character, instead of just technical violations of protocol. And now, that moment of truth had finally arrived. Emma sat in the witness stand, Castellano watched with that confident smile, lawyers prepared to attack, and Jake absent physically but present in every other way that mattered. Emma had spent the entire morning of that Friday preparing herself, not only externally choosing clothes that projected competence without seeming to try too hard, practicing deep breaths to control anxiety that threatened to overflow, but internally as well. Revisiting every conversation she had had with Jake about strength, about not letting fear dictate actions, about trusting that truth was enough, even when the system seemed designed to distort truth into something unrecognizable. Jake had held her face that morning before she left the temporary apartment under federal protection. Had looked directly into her eyes with that intensity that always made her stop and really listen. "Emma, you survived abduction," he had said in a voice heavy with absolute conviction. "You survived hours believing you were going to die. You maintained dignity and composure through terror that would have broken far more experienced people. Lawyers in a courtroom can't do anything to you that's worse than what you've already survived." And then Jake added something that Emma had been carrying, like a mantra, as she sat in that chair, waiting for Prosecutor Chen to begin questioning. "I believe in you, completely. I don't just believe you'll survive this, but I believe you'll win. Because you're no longer that scared woman from the alley 3 months ago. You've transformed into someone who knows her own worth, who understands her own strength. And Emma, I'll be there even if I can't be physically there. Every word you speak, I'll be behind you, strong, silent, absolutely certain that you have exactly what you need. If you've ever faced a situation where you knew people were underestimating you, where they had made judgments about who you were based on circumstances rather than character, share in the comments how you found the strength to prove them wrong. Because what Emma was about to do in that courtroom wasn't just about testifying in a criminal case, it was about refusing to accept the narrative that other people were trying to impose on her. About standing up for her own truth, even when the cost of doing so was public exposure and brutal scrutiny. Emma looked around the room, cataloging the faces that would be observing every word, every expression, every moment of hesitation that could be interpreted as an indication that she was lying or hiding something. Jury 12 citizens who had been specifically selected because they had no preconceived opinions about the case, but who inevitably brought their own biases about what a reliable witness looked like. Judge Thompson presiding with an expression of professional neutrality that came from decades on the bench. Prosecutor Chen organizing documents with an efficiency that suggested confidence in her strategy. And Rebecca Torres sat in the gallery, the only person besides lawyers that Emma knew personally in that room. Rebecca had looked at Emma when she entered and had made a subtle gesture, just a minimal nod that communicated encouragement and confidence. Rebecca, who had seen Emma at her lowest points, who had been there in the warehouse minutes after the rescue when Emma was still trembling and in shock, who had witnessed the transformation over weeks of legal protocols and preparation for exactly this moment. If this part resonates with you, if you're feeling the weight of what Emma is about to face, not just physical fear, but the psychological fear of being publicly dissected, of having the most important relationship of her life turned into evidence to be analyzed by strangers leave alike here. Because what comes next will show exactly what happens when a woman who has been underestimated decides she will no longer be silent. That she will no longer allow someone else's narrative about her to replace the truth she knows. Prosecutor Chen stood up, and there was something in her posture that communicated that she was about to begin, that the preparation phase was over, and the moment for action had arrived. She made brief eye contact with Emma, a smile, because this was a courtroom and not a place for lightness, but an acknowledgement that said, "You can do this. Just remember what we practiced. Good morning." "Ms. Carson," Chen began in a tone that was professional but not cold, establishing rapport before diving into difficult questions. "Thank you for being here today to testify. I know this isn't easy." Emma nodded, allowing herself a moment to acknowledge the truth of that statement. It wasn't easy. It was terrifying in ways that the kidnapping hadn't been, because during the kidnapping she only had to survive moment by moment. Here, she had to think about every word, consider how it would be interpreted, maintain composure, while knowing that the man who had ordered her death was sitting 15 feet away, watching her every reaction. But Emma also knew that if she wanted to follow the rest of this journey, if she wanted to see how this story of a woman finding strength through love that anchored her, even when everything else was chaotic, if she wanted to find out if her testimony would be enough to keep Castellano imprisoned, and if Jake would eventually accept a deal or risk a trial, she had to subscribe to the channel. Because this story is only beginning to reveal deeper layers about what it means to have someone who believes in you so completely, that their trust becomes the foundation of your own courage. And as Emma took a deep breath, preparing to answer Chun's first question, she mentally held onto an image of Jake Knott, as he was now facing his own legal crisis. But as he had been that morning, holding her face and saying with absolute certainty that she had exactly what she needed. And that image, that memory of his unwavering confidence, became the anchor that would keep her steady through everything that was to come. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Emma's preparation over the past 3 days wasn't just about memorizing facts or practicing answers with lawyers in formal sessions. It was about a fundamental transformation in how she viewed her own identity, from a passive victim of circumstances to an active agent capable of shaping outcomes through a strength she had discovered she possessed. And behind that transformation was the emotional and psychological journey that Jake had facilitated, not through commands or imposed expectations, but by repeatedly reminding her of a hidden truth she had been avoiding, that she was much stronger than she allowed herself to believe. Emma had spent the last 3 days preparing for this moment in ways that went far beyond simply reviewing facts with Prosecutor Chen and her legal team. Yes, there had been hours of technical sessions where Chen had asked every possible question Castellano's lawyers could ask, where they had practiced honest but strategically worded responses, where they had anticipated objections and prepared counterarguments. But real preparation, the transformation that truly mattered, had happened in private conversations with Jake during the wee hours of the morning, when anxiety made sleep impossible. Emma had prepared herself emotionally by directly confronting each fear she had about testifying. Fear of being publicly humiliated, of having her relationship with Jake dissected and judged by strangers, of saying something wrong that would harm the case against Castellano or Jake's defense. Fear that, under the pressure of hostile cross-examination, she would break down in ways that would confirm the defense lawyer's narrative about her being an unreliable witness, compromised by trauma and addiction. And Jake had helped Emma process those fears, not by minimizing them or saying they were irrational, but by acknowledging their validity and then gently challenging underlying assumptions. "Emma," he had said during one of those 3 o'clock conversations, when she had woken from a nightmare about witnessing, "You're treating this as if strength means never feeling fear. But real strength is acting despite paralyzing terror." It's feeling fear completely and choosing to do the hard thing anyway. Emma had prepared herself psychologically, consciously deciding that she wouldn't enter that courtroom as a victim, pleading for pity or understanding from the jury. She would enter as a witness, presenting a truth with the force that came from having survived worse than anything lawyers' words could do to her. Because Emma had realized during those 3 days of preparation that she had already faced a much more difficult test she had faced. Her own mortality for hours, tied to that chair in the warehouse, knowing that execution was coming. And if she had survived that with her dignity intact, if she had maintained her composure even when terrified, then she could absolutely survive lawyers trying to twist words or suggest she was lying or compromised. Lawyers could question her credibility, but they couldn't really hurt her in ways that mattered because worse had already happened and she had emerged on the other side. Jake had been instrumental in that transformation, but not in obvious or direct ways. He hadn't told Emma to be strong or fake courage, commands that would have been not only useless but counterproductive because they would have suggested that the strength and courage she already possessed were inadequate. Instead, Jake had simply reminded Emma of all the times during the past weeks when she had demonstrated strength she didn't even realize she possessed at the time. "Remember when you insisted on learning how to use a gun?" Jake had said during one of the preparation sessions when Emma was doubting her own abilities. "Your hands were shaking so much you could barely hold it, and you were terrified of accidentally hurting yourself. But you insisted on learning anyway because you didn't want to be a completely passive victim. Emma, that's courage. Not the absence of fear, but action despite fear." Jake continued cataloging moments that Emma had forgotten or minimized. "Remember when you decided to go to that apartment to get clothes for the hearing, even when I warned you it was risky? You weighed the danger against the importance of autonomy and made a conscious choice. Not an impulsive or careless choice, but an informed decision that living in constant fear without any control over your own life was unacceptable. That's strength of character, Emma." And perhaps more importantly, Jake had reminded Emma of how he had behaved during his own kidnapping details. She only knew through his and Rebecca's accounts, because her own memory of those hours was fragmented by trauma. "Rebecca told me that when they entered that room and saw you, the first thing they noticed was that you were talking to the kidnappers," Jake had recounted. "Not screaming or begging, but actually conversing with them in a way that tried to humanize you, that tried to create a connection that would make it harder for them to hurt you. Emma, that's tactical intelligence under extreme pressure." Jake had explained that Emma had refused to completely fall apart even when terrified, that she had maintained some level of composure and dignity through hours that would have broken many people completely. "You didn't pretend not to be afraid," Jake had clarified, "but you didn't let fear consume you too. The point of not functioning. You kept your mind working, looking for opportunities, actively trying to survive, instead of just passively accepting death. And now, sitting in that witness chair with Prosecutor Chen, about to begin questioning in Castellano, watching with that confident smile, Emma was transforming all that accumulated fear and trauma into a determination to ensure that Castellano did not escape justice through legal technicalities or expensive lawyers who knew how to manipulate the system. Emma had decided, during those 3 days of preparation, that she would use every ounce of strength she had discovered she possessed, not for revenge, because that would have been toxic and counterproductive, but for justice. To ensure that the man who had ordered her kidnapping and planned execution faced appropriate consequences. To ensure that Jake's sacrifice lost badge, destroyed career, possible imprisonment, was not wasted because she failed to be a strong enough witness. And Emma had decided that she was going to do this not only for herself or for Jake, but for all the other potential victims that Castellano would victimize if allowed to operate freely. For Sarah Hollis, whom Jake still carried the guilt of not having saved 6 years ago. For the next person who witnessed Castellano's crime and would have to decide whether to report it, knowing the risk of retaliation. Comment below. She transformed fear into strength through purpose. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that moment when Emma crossed the threshold of that courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning wasn't just about physically entering a space. It was about crossing a psychological boundary between preparation and actual action, between rehearsing strength in a controlled environment and demonstrating it under the hostile scrutiny of people who had a vested interest in making her seem untrustworthy. And behind that entrance lay a hidden truth about the impact of decisions that had led to this moment, every choice Emma and Jake had made over weeks converging on this single point where everything would be tested. When Emma entered the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, punctuality being a form of control, a refusal to arrive late or rushed in ways that would communicate disorganization or anxiety, the first thing her brain registered with painful clarity was the presence of Vincent Castellano, not in an orange prison uniform as Emma had half expected, half desired, because that would have visually communicated that he was a dangerous criminal, but in an expensive, perfectly tailored suit that projected respectability and success, dark navy blue, with an impeccable white shirt and a tie that probably cost more than Emma earned in a week. Castellano sat at the defense table with the posture of a man completely at ease in court. A man who had been through the legal system multiple times before and knew exactly how to project respectable innocence. He was surrounded by 3 lawyers, not just Robert Thorne, who would lead cross-examination, but 2 junior associates, who would be passing notes and pointing to legal precedents, and generally providing tactical support, all with expressions that communicated supreme confidence that the motion to disqualify Emma's testimony based on a compromised relationship with Jake would be successful. And when Castellano noticed Emma entering, he did something that made her blood run cold. He smiled. Not an obvious or threatening smile that a court official or jury would notice, but a subtle curve of his lips that was just for Emma, which clearly said that he wasn't worried, that he was confident his lawyers would destroy her credibility until her testimony was useless. The second thing Emma noticed in his absence was just as impactful as Castellano's presence had been, was that Jake wasn't there. She had known intellectually that he couldn't attend, that he had been legally prohibited because he was both a potential witness in Castellano's case and a subject of a related criminal investigation, so his presence would create conflicts of interest that would complicate proceedings in unacceptable ways. But knowing intellectually and experiencing his absence emotionally were completely different things. Emma had grown accustomed over the weeks to having Jake physically present during difficult times, literally by her side or in the adjacent room, always accessible if she needed reassurance or simply his solid presence as an anchor. And his absence at this crucial moment they had both prepared for days felt like a physical loss in Emma's heart. But then Emma saw Rebecca Torres sitting in the 3rd row of the gallery, and some of that feeling of loss eased slightly. Rebecca was in professional FBI agent attire, not a formal uniform but a suit that conveyed official authority. And when she made eye contact with Emma, there was an expression of support and encouragement that was not only professional but personal. Rebecca, who had seen Emma at her lowest point in the warehouse minutes after the rescue, who had witnessed her transformation over weeks, who genuinely believed in Emma's strength, and seated 2 rows behind Rebecca, strategically positioned where Emma could easily see him if she turned her head even slightly, was Marcus Chunjik's criminal defense attorney, who ironically shared a last name with prosecutor Sandra Chen, but no family relationship. Marcus had come not because he had an official role in this proceeding, but because he had promised Jake that he would be there as a visual representative of Jake's trust, as a physical reminder that Jake would be there if legally permitted. Emma walked across the room, not quickly, as if hurried or nervous, but with a measured pace that conveyed purpose and control, to the table where prosecutor Sandra Chen sat reviewing closing notes before the proceedings began. Chen was a woman in her late 40s with a reputation for being exceptionally prepared and brutally effective in court. known for never bringing a case unless she was confident the evidence was solid enough for conviction. When Chen looked up and saw Emma approaching, there was something in her eyes that Emma hadn't fully expected to respect, not just the tactical witness assessment Chen was about to employ, but genuine respect for a woman who had survived trauma and was willing to face public scrutiny to ensure justice. "Are you ready?" Chen asked softly, his voice low enough not to be heard by others in the room, but carrying the real weight of a question. Not a rhetorical question or a formality, but a genuine check to see if Emma was emotionally and psychologically prepared for what she was about to face. "Yes," Emma replied, and she meant it completely. Not with arrogant confidence or denial of how difficult it would be, but with the certainty that came from processing fears, from making the necessary preparations, from deciding that this was something she had to do no matter the personal cost. "I'm ready." Chen nodded, and there was satisfaction in her expression. "Good. Because Thorne is exceptional at destroying witnesses through technique, rather than obvious aggression. He'll be polite, he'll seem reasonable. But every question will be designed to undermine your credibility in ways the jury may not immediately perceive. Remember what the question that was asked, not the question you think he's actually asking. Don't defend yourself when you haven't been accused. Keep your answers concise." "I understand," Emma said, mentally revisiting all the preparation sessions where they had practiced exactly these techniques. Chen glanced at his watch. 3 minutes until Judge Thompson enters. Use this time to focus. Breathe. Remember that truth is your ally here. And Thorne can twist words, but he can't change the fundamental facts of what happened. Emma nodded and went to sit in the chair designated for witnesses, not in the actual witness chair yet, because that would come after preliminary procedures, but in a reserved area. And as she sat, she allowed herself a moment to truly feel Jake's absence in ways she hadn't experienced when he was in motion. Jake should have been here. He should have been sitting where Marcus was. He should have been able to make eye contact with her when she needed that anchor. He should have been able to witness her defending their relationship against attacks from lawyers. But the system wouldn't allow it, and so Emma would have to find strength internally instead of through his physical presence. Except Emma realized, sitting there, waiting for the judge to enter, feeling the weight of the impending decision, that Jake was present in ways that mattered. He was present in every lesson about strength he had taught through example. He was present in the trust he had in her that had become part of how she saw herself. He was present in the love they had built that served as the foundation under everything else. And Emma realized that the transformation she had undergone in the last few weeks meant that she didn't need Jake physically by her side to access strength. That strength had become a part of her, integrated in ways that couldn't be taken away by his absence, or by attacks from lawyers, or by anything external. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because those first 30 minutes of testimony weren't just about Emma reciting chronological facts or answering technical questions about dates and events. They were about establishing fundamental credibility through every word chosen, every calculated pause, every moment of eye contact with the jury that communicated she was a trustworthy witness, narrating real experience rather than a fabricated story. And behind that initial testimony was the revelation of how intensive preparation with Chen had transformed Emma's anxiety into controlled performance. Not performance in the sense of acting, but in the sense of skillfully presenting truth in ways that the audience could process and believe. Emma's first 30 minutes of testimony were critical in ways that went beyond simply establishing basic facts of the case. They were about building a foundation of credibility that would make the jury receptive when Chen eventually got to more complicated and controversial issues about Emma's relationship with Jake, about whether that relationship compromised her testimony in ways that made it unreliable. Chen had explained the strategy during preparation. If we start with questions about Jake's relationship, the jury immediately becomes skeptical and questions everything you say afterward. But if we first establish that you are a clear, consistent, detailed witness to specific events, The jury begins to trust you based on objective testimony about verifiable facts. Then when we get to relationship questions, they are more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. So Chen began methodically, building the case brick by brick through questions that had direct and verifiable answers. Ms. Carson, can you tell us where you were on the night of September 15th? I was returning home after a night shift at the hospital, Emma replied clearly, her voice firm without being defensive or overly rehearsed. I worked from 7 at night until 7 in the morning as a nurse in the emergency unit. And which route did you take home? The usual route through the central business district, Emma said. And she could feel the facts flowing naturally because they were true. Not history she had to remember, but experience she had lived. I'll turn right onto Main Street, then left onto Fifth Avenue. Chen continued constructing the chronology with methodical precision. And what happened when I was walking down Fifth Avenue? I heard a noise coming from an alley between an abandoned building and a warehouse, Emma replied. And even now, months later, she could remember that moment with painful clarity. Sounds that seemed like a fight or a confrontation. I stopped because I thought someone might need help. What did you see when you looked down the alley? Emma made eye contact with the jury, not all at once, in a calculated way, but sweeping naturally in a way that created connection. I saw 3 men surrounding a woman who was clearly terrified. One of the men was holding a gun. Another had what appeared to be an envelope with money. And I recognized one of the men as Vincent Castellano, because I had seen his picture in the newspaper the previous week, in an article about local business leaders. Chen paused, letting that detail sink in. Did you have prior knowledge of Mr. Castellano before that night? Only from the newspaper article, Emma clarified. I didn't know him personally. I'd never interacted with him in any way. Chen continued through the chronology, what Emma had specifically seen, what she had overheard from the conversation, how she had stayed long enough to clearly identify faces before realizing danger and leaving, how she had gone directly to the police station to report. Emma answered each question with details that were specific but not overly elaborate, sounding like genuine memory rather than a rehearsed script. And while witnessing, Emma maintained appropriate eye contact with the jury when answering questions directed at them, not staring uncomfortably, but creating moments of human connection that made her seem like a real person with real experience, rather than just an abstract witness. When Chen asked how she felt witnessing the confrontation in the alley, Emma not only said scared, but explained with specificity that it created empathy. My heart racing so fast I could hear my pulse in my ears, my hands starting to tremble. That feeling of recognizing danger, but not fully processing it until seconds later. And through it all, Emma could feel Castellano watching her. She didn't look directly at him because Chen had instructed her during preparation that this would be a tactical error. It doesn't give him satisfaction to see that his presence affects you. It doesn't create moments of visual confrontation that lawyers can use to suggest personal animosity. But Emma could feel the weight of that gaze as a physical presence. She could feel Castellano trying to intimidate her into hesitation or contradiction through sheer force of constant observation. But Emma didn't hesitate. Not because she didn't feel intimidated. That fear was real and present. That awareness that the man who had ordered her death was sitting 15 feet away, watching her every word. But because she had Jake behind her in ways that went beyond physical presence. She had a constant reminder that he had risked literally everything, badge, career, freedom, to give her this chance to sit in that chair and tell the truth. And Emma had decided during preparation that she wasn't going to waste that sacrifice by letting fear dictate her actions. That she was going to honor Jake's choice to prioritize her by being the strongest and clearest witness possible. By not letting Castellano's intimidation or his lawyer's tactics make her back down from the truth she knew. Chen moved on to a timeline of threats that had followed Emma's initial testimony. After you reported what you saw that night, what happened? I received my first threat 3 days later, Emma said. and she could remember exactly how she had felt finding that Noda security breach. A sudden realization that she had put herself in real danger. A note left on my car's windshield, saying that witnesses who don't know when to keep quiet sometimes get into accidents. And did you report that threat? Yes, immediately, Emma confirmed. I went to the police station and spoke with a detective who was investigating the original case. That's when I met Sheriff Mercer for the first time. He was coordinating the investigation and was concerned that threats indicated Castellano's organization was taking my testimony seriously. Emma continued through a chronology of escalating threats. The second message was the most explicit. The third was delivered directly to her apartment in ways that indicated they knew where she lived. The fourth made specific mention of her family in ways that revealed they had done research. And with each threat Emma described, the jury could see a pattern of systematic intimidation, could understand that this was not the paranoia of an anxious witness, but a real campaign to silently terrorize her. Chen established that Emma had cooperated fully with the investigation despite escalating threats, that she had continued working shifts at the hospital, even when she had legitimate reason to be afraid, and that she had done everything the system asked of her as a responsible citizen reporting crime. She was building a narrative of Emma as a courageous person doing the right thing, despite personal cost to Foundation, that would make it more difficult for Castellano's lawyers later to portray her as compromised or unreliable. And while witnessing as Emma moved through those first 30 minutes, she found a rhythm that came from practice, but didn't sound rehearsed. She paused when she needed to gather her thoughts before responding. Wasn't afraid to say, I don't remember that specific detail. When appropriate, instead of making it up, and kept her voice at a register that was audible without shouting, that communicated confidence without arrogance. Comment below. Witnessing truth requires a different kind of strength than surviving trauma. Both are valid. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because that moment when Robert Thorne stood up for cross-examination wasn't just a technical transition from direct to hostile questioning. It was a turning point where Emma's real test of strength began, where meticulous preparation met the reality of an experienced lawyer systematically attempting to destroy credibility through subtle psychological techniques, instead of obvious attacks that a jury would recognize as unfair. And behind that strategy was a hidden truth about how the legal system sometimes protects procedure more than people. How lawyers can use genuine relationships as weapons to undermine testimony, even when those relationships don't compromise the fundamental truth of what the witness observed. After Prosecutor Chen finished direct questioning, after 50 minutes establishing a detailed chronology of the original crime, escalating threats, and Emma's consistent cooperation with the investigation, she sat down with an expression that conveyed satisfaction with how Emma had performed, but also apprehension about what would come next. Because they both knew that the easy part was over, that the foundation of credibility they had built was about to be attacked in ways that would be technically legal but emotionally brutal. Castellano's lead attorney, a man named Robert Thorne, who had a reputation in legal circles for being exceptionally skilled at destroying witnesses through refined technique rather than overt aggression that juries would recognize as bullying, rose from the defense table with deliberate movements that communicated complete confidence. Thorne was in his late 50s, with perfectly combed gray hair, expensive framed glasses that projected intellectuality, and a suit that probably cost $5,000 but which he wore casually as if it were everyday clothing. And when Emma looked into his eyes as he approached the podium from which he would conduct cross-examination, she immediately saw that he was going for the jugular, that he had a specific strategy to undermine her credibility that he had rehearsed and refined through decades of practice. There was no personal malice in those eyes. This was purely professional for Thorne. Just work he did exceptionally well, but there was a cold determination to accomplish his objective, regardless of the emotional cost to the witness. "Good morning, Miss Carson," Thorne began, his tone superficially polite, almost gentle. but laden with an underlying skepticism that the jury might not immediately detect, but that Emma felt viscerally. "Thank you for your testimony this morning. I have a few clarifying questions." Emma nodded, maintaining a neutral expression, recalling Chen's instructions. When Thorne is being polite, that's when he's most dangerous. He uses politeness as a weapon, making you lower your guard before attacking. "Ms. Carson," Thorne continued, briefly consulting notes before making direct eye contact, "you developed a romantic relationship with Sheriff Jake Mercer during a period when he was providing protection against threats you claimed to have received, correct?" And there it was, the first arrow fired, and Emma noticed the careful construction of the question. Claims to have received instead of simply received, planting a seed of doubt about the veracity of threats from the outset. "Yes," Emma confirmed simply, without trying to deny, soften, or justify. Chen had been clear during preparation. When Thorne asks a question that can be answered with yes or no, he answers only with yes or no. He doesn't give him extra material to work with, unless the question requires elaboration. And this romantic relationship included you living in Sheriff Mercer's personal home, correct? Not in an officially designated protected location run by a federal department or agency, but in his private residence. "Correct," Emma said, keeping her voice steady even though she could see where this was going. She could anticipate the attack that was coming. Thorne paused, letting that fact sink in with the jury, the image of a witness living in an officer's home. The physical and emotional intimacy implied in that arrangement. And then he posed a question that revealed the complete strategy. "Ms. Carson, isn't it true that you were completely dependent on Sheriff Mercer during that period? That he controlled where you went, who you saw, what information you received about the progress of the case against my client?" And there it was, Thorne's strategy, completely revealed in broad daylight. Not attacking Emma's credibility directly, by suggesting she was lying about witnessing a crime or about threats she received. Physical and documentary evidence made those attacks untenable. Instead, attacking by suggesting she had been coerced through psychological dependence. That her relationship with Jake had created a situation where her testimony was a product not of objective observation, but of distorted loyalty, or Stockholm Syndrome, or any number of problematic psychological dynamics. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the moment of choice. She could respond defensively. She could allow the implication of the question to make her angry or emotional in ways that would confirm Thorne's narrative about her being committed. Or she could respond clearly, that she came from knowing the truth, from having fully processed the nature of her relationship with Jake during preparation. "No, that's not true," Emma said, and there was a strength in her voice that came not from anger, but from certainty. "Sheriff Mercer never controlled my movements or decisions, Mr. Thorne. He provided professional security advice based on threat assessments, and I chose to follow that advice because it made tactical sense. But when I disagreed with his recommendations, such as when I insisted on going to my apartment to get clothes, despite his concerns about risk, he respected my autonomy, even though it clearly worried him." Thorne raised an eyebrow, his body language communicating skepticism even without words. "But Ms. Carson, you were living under his roof, dependent on him for physical safety, isolated from friends and family. How can you argue that you had real autonomy in that situation?" "Because autonomy isn't about external circumstances," Emma replied, gaining confidence as she articulated truths she had processed during conversations with Jake. "It's about who controls decisions. And Mr. Thorne, Jake Sheriff Mercer never made decisions for me without consulting me, never prevented me from seeking alternative protection if I wanted, never used his position as an officer, or the fact that he was providing security as leverage to control my behavior." Emma paused, allowing herself a moment of calculated vulnerability. "Yes, I was in difficult circumstances. Yes, I depended on him for physical safety, because his client's organization had placed me in real danger. But dependence for physical safety is not the same as having no agency or being psychologically coerced. I consistently made choices during that period, choices about whether to continue testifying, about how to manage fear, about how to process the situation. And none of those choices were forced by Sheriff Mercer. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because Emma's response, that refusal to accept the narrative Thorne was trying to construct about her being a victim without agency, wasn't just about defending her relationship with Jake. It was about a fundamental transformation that had taken place within her during weeks of confronting fear. The discovery that true strength doesn't come from never needing help, but from knowing the difference between accepting necessary support and allowing oneself to be controlled. And behind that distinction was a revelation about the impact Jake's love had had, not creating dependence, but providing a secure foundation from which Emma could rebuild a sense of agency that trauma had temporarily compromised. Emma took a deep breath before responding to Thorne's next attack, remembering everything Jake had said during those 3 a.m. conversations about not feeling guilty for needing protection, about their relationship being a genuine choice, born of real compatibility, rather than a problematic power dynamic. And when she responded, it wasn't defensively, not with the anger or emotion Thorne could use to suggest. She was overly invested in defending Jake, but with a clarity that came from knowing the fundamental truth about who she was and what their relationship truly represented. "No, that's not true in the way you're suggesting," Emma said. And there was a force in her voice that clearly made Thorne pause, that made him recalibrate his approach, because the witness he hoped to intimidate was responding with a confidence that didn't seem rehearsed but genuine. "Jake Sheriff Mercer never controlled my movements or decisions in the ways you're implying. Yes, he provided professional security advice based on years of law enforcement experience and specific threat assessments of the threats his client's organization posed. And yes, I chose to follow that advice most of the time because it made tactical sense. Because I'm not an idiot, and I recognized that he had expertise I lacked." Emma leaned forward. He moved forward minimally, engaging directly with Thorne in ways that communicated he wasn't backing down. "But Mr. Thorne, when I disagreed with his recommendations, such as when I insisted on going to my apartment to get appropriate clothing for this hearing, despite his legitimate concerns about increased risk while his client was free on bail, Sheriff Mercer respected my autonomy, even though it clearly worried him, even though he expressed that concern multiple times." Emma continued, gaining momentum as she articulated a truth she had fully processed. "He didn't stop me. He didn't use his authority as an officer, or the fact that he was providing protection as leverage to force compliance. He presented an argument about why he thought it was risky. I weighed that argument against the importance to me of having clothes that made me feel confident and in control, and I made a decision, which is exactly how adults in a healthy relationship operate, presenting perspectives, respecting each other's agency, allowing each person to make final decisions about their own behavior." Thorne adjusted his glasses, a movement Emma had learned during training that told him she was preparing to change her angle of attack. "Ms. Carson, you mentioned healthy relationship, but isn't it true that you developed these romantic feelings under extremely abnormal circumstances? That you were isolated, terrified, dependent on Sheriff Mercer for basic survival? Psychologists have a term for this: Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages or people in situations of dependency develop an attachment to their captor or protector that doesn't reflect a genuine choice, but a psychological response to trauma." And there it was, Thorne playing the card that Emma and Chen had anticipated, that they had specifically prepared to counterattack. Emma didn't allow the suggestion to make her defensive. She didn't respond angrily, which would have confirmed that the question had struck a nerve. Instead, she calmly replied that she had been thinking deeply about exactly this issue. "Mr. Thorne, I'm familiar with the concept of Stockholm Syndrome," Emma said, "and with all due respect, you're misapplying it. Stockholm Syndrome involves developing an attachment to the person who is actively holding you hostage or causing you harm. Jake Sheriff Mercer was never my captor. He was an officer protecting me from people who wanted to hurt me. And Mr. Thorne, the feelings I developed for him weren't a product of isolation or terror, but of consistent observation over weeks of how he treated me. Emma elaborated, feeling the jury paying closer attention now that she was articulating something that resonated emotionally. When I was terrified at night, he didn't use that fear to create dependency. He taught me how to use a weapon so I could have some sense of agency over my own safety. When I wanted to process events through conversation, he listened without judging or trying to control the narrative. When we disagreed on strategy or approach, he presented his perspective but respected when I made a different decision. Emma paused, allowing herself a moment of genuine vulnerability. And Mr. Thorne, I wasn't psychologically dependent on him in the ways you're suggesting. I developed feelings for a man who consistently demonstrated character through his actions, who treated me as a complete person worthy of respect, even when I was vulnerable, who valued my opinion even when I had more experience or technical knowledge. And when his client ordered my kidnapping and Sheriff Mercer risked his entire career to save me, not because he had an investment in controlling me, but because the decision to let me die was unacceptable to his values that didn't create dependency. It confirmed a judgment I'd been making for weeks about the kind of person he was. Thorne tried to interrupt, but Emma continued, feeling there was more she needed to articulate. So no, Mr. Thorne, this isn't Stockholm Syndrome. This isn't pathological dependence or attachment formed through trauma. It's a conscious, informed, deliberate choice to love someone who has proven through hundreds of small interactions and a few big ones that they were worthy of that love. And the fact that that love developed in difficult circumstances doesn't make it any less genuine, if anything. It makes it more so because it has been tested in ways that most relationships never face. Comment below. Love born in crisis can be more genuine than love in comfort. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Emma's powerful articulation about the nature of genuine love versus pathological dependence didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because, although Jake wasn't physically present, in the room, banished by conflicts of interest that the legal system couldn't ignore, Ma could feel his presence in ways that transcended physical proximity. And behind that spiritual presence was a revelation about the transformation that happens when real love provides not a comfortable cage but a foundation from which a person can find their own strength, where someone's trust in you becomes part of how you see yourself. Although Jake wasn't physically present in the room, although Emma couldn't look into the gallery and meet his gaze when she needed reassurance, couldn't see his posture communicating silent support, she could feel his presence in ways that weren't entirely rational, but were absolutely real. She could hear his voice in her mind saying specific things he had said during 3 days of intensive preparation. Phrases that had become mantras she accessed when Thorne launched a particularly brutal attack. Tell your truth, Emma. Don't let lawyers twist the relationship into something it wasn't. Jake's voice was clear, as if he were whispering directly in her ear instead of probably being at home processing his own anxiety about how the testimony was going. Forced to trust that the preparation they had done would be sufficient without being able to directly observe or intervene if things started to fall apart. You know the difference between real love and dependence because you've experienced both now. Trust that knowledge. These were the words Jake had said when Emma had expressed exactly this fear that under pressure from a skilled lawyer, she would begin to question her own perceptions. That she would begin to wonder if perhaps Thorne was right about the relationship being a product of trauma rather than a genuine choice. And Emma could feel the confidence Jake had in her, not blind confidence or hope-based confidence, but a certainty born of seeing her demonstrate strength repeatedly for weeks, of knowing she had exactly what she needed to face this. That confidence had become part of how Emma saw herself, internalized in ways that meant that even without Jake present, she carried his belief in her as armor against Thorne's attacks. And when Thorne continued attacking, pivoting from Stockholm Syndrome to a new line of questioning that attempted to undermine credibility from different angles, Emma answered each question with a clarity that came not only from technical preparation, but from a deep understanding that Jake would be proud of her for not backing down, for not letting intimidation work, for standing up for the truth even when the cost of doing so was the brutal exposure of private moments. "Ms. Carson," Thorne said, consulting notes with a calculated pause that created tension. "You claim that the threats you received were real and genuine. But isn't it convenient that many of these threats lacked physical evidence beyond your word? Text messages you deleted, phone calls you didn't record, notes you say you found but didn't properly preserve for forensic analysis." Emma felt a flash of anger, not defensive anger, but righteous anger, that Thorne was distorting circumstances in ways that ignored the reality of how terror works. "Mr. Thorne," she replied with careful control, "when you receive a death threat for the first time, instinct isn't immediately to think, I need to preserve this as forensic evidence. Instinct is panic, it's visceral fear, it's sometimes destroying whatever is terrifying you as a way to regain some sense of control." Emma continued, not allowing Thorne to make her defensive about normal human responses to trauma. "Yes, I deleted the first threatening text because I was terrified and didn't want to look at it every time I opened my phone. I later learned to preserve evidence, and you can see that subsequent threats were all reported and properly documented. But, Mr. Thorne, the fact that my initial response to trauma wasn't perfectly calibrated for legal needs doesn't make the threats any less real." Thorne changed tactics again, now suggesting that Emma had exaggerated the danger to justify living with Jake. "Isn't it true, Ms. Carson, that you could have chosen official protection through the Federal Witness Protection Program, but chose to stay with Sheriff Mercer because the relationship was already developing?" "No," Emma corrected firmly. "The timeline doesn't support that narrative. The romantic relationship didn't begin until weeks after I started staying at Jake's house, and the choice to stay with him instead of going into witness protection was based on his professional advice about which option provided better security given specific threats. He didn't pressure me to choose his house. He presented the pros and cons of each option, and I made my decision based on tactical assessment." Emma could sense a shift in the room. The jury was paying different attention now, not seeing a witness breaking down under pressure, but a woman defending the truth with a specificity and clarity that suggested genuine honesty. And Castellano had stopped smiling, Emma noticed peripherally. His confident expression had been replaced by something closer to concern as he realized Thorne's strategy wasn't working as expected. Thorne tried a few more lines of attacks, suggesting that Emma's testimony about her relationship with Jake was calculated to help his defense in a criminal case, that she had a vested interest in portraying him favorably because their futures were intertwined. But each time Emma responded not defensively, but with clarity that dismantled underlying premises. "Mr. Thorne, if I were calculating testimony to help Jake, I wouldn't be honest about the complexities and difficulties of our relationship. I would be tempted to paint it as perfect, to portray every interaction as ideal, but that would be a lie. The truth is that we had disagreements, that there were moments of tension, that circumstances were difficult in ways that tested us both. But it's also true that he treated me with consistent respect, that he never used his position to control me, that the choices he made were motivated by genuine values rather than a problematic personal agenda." Rebecca Torres, observing from the gallery, would later tell Jake that it was at that moment, approximately 90 minutes into cross-examination, when Emma had resisted each of Thorne's attacks with a combination of vulnerable honesty and resolute strength, as she saw a complete transformation. Not a gradual, but a sudden shift in perception, where it became clear that Emma was no longer merely surviving interrogation, no longer merely resisting attacks, but was actively fighting, was shaping the narrative through sheer force of conviction. Emma was no longer operating as a self-defense victim, Rebecca would later explain. She was operating as a force to be reckoned with, as a person who knew her own truth so completely that external attacks could not make her question the foundation of that knowledge. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that moment when Thorne made a crucial tactical error was not an accident or a slip uncharacteristic of an experienced lawyer. It was the inevitable consequence of a strategy that had worked hundreds of times before, pushing witnesses to breaking point through progressively more offensive suggestions until they reacted emotionally in ways that undermined credibility. And behind that tactic was a hidden truth about the impact of underestimating witness strength. Thorne had entered that room expecting a traumatized woman who could be manipulated into contradictions, but had found a transformed woman who knew her own truth so deeply that external attacks only solidified her resolve, instead of creating doubt. The definitive turning point came approximately 2 hours into cross-examination, when Thorne, perhaps frustrated by Emma's resilience, or calculating that he needed to provoke a dramatic emotional reaction to undermine any controlled performance she had maintained, made the tactical error of pushing too far, crossing the line from suggesting questionable tactics to directly accusing her of outright fabrication. "Miss Carson," Thorne said, and there was a shift in his tone, now less polite skepticism and more direct accusation, that Emma immediately recognized as dangerous. "Isn't it true that you invented the whole kidnapping story to justify Sheriff Mercer's actions? That in reality he acted out of jealousy or obsession? Perhaps he found out you were considering ending the relationship. Perhaps he realized that the psychological dependence he had cultivated was beginning to wear off, and you're covering it up for him through an elaborate story about no." Emma interrupted him before he could finish that offensive sentence, and there was anger in her voice now. Not defensive anger, stemming from being hit in a vulnerable spot, but the righteous, controlled anger of someone confronting such an absurd lie that it demanded immediate and unequivocal correction. "No, Mr. Thorne. That statement is not only false but offensively distorted from facts that are verifiable through multiple independent sources." Emma adjusted herself in her chair, her posture straightening, her body language communicating that a line had been crossed, and she wasn't going to let that narrative go unchallenged. "Mr. Thorne, I can show this court still visible marks on my wrists, where zip ties were tightened hard enough to cut off circulation and leave deep bruises that took weeks to heal completely. I can provide detailed medical reports from the hospital where I was treated immediately after rescue, documenting not only wrist injuries but facial hematoma, defensive scratches, and signs of acute traumatic stress." Emma's voice was growing stronger, firmer, not shouting but with an intensity that made everyone in the room focus completely. "And Mr. Thorne, there are 3 men, 1 dead at the scene of the rescue. 2 currently in custody awaiting their own trials, who can and will confirm under oath that the kidnapping happened exactly as I described. Marcus Reyes, your client's right-hand man, is literally available to testify because he was wounded by Sheriff Mercer during the rescue. How exactly could I have fabricated a hostile witness to confirm events?" Emma leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with the determination to ensure the jury saw her conviction. "And what about your suggestion that Sheriff Mercer acted out of jealousy or obsession? Let me be absolutely clear about this. The man who saved me is now facing serious criminal charges because he prioritized my life over the career he built over 14 years. He lost his badge, he lost his reputation, he's potentially facing years in prison. Mr. Thorne, if that's what obsession looks like in your opinion, then honestly the world needs more obsessive people and fewer people like your client who ordered the executions of innocent witnesses as a business tactic." There was a moment of absolute silence in the room after that statement. Judge Thompson looked at Emma with an expression that suggested surprise at the vehemence of her response, but also recognition that Thorne had provoked her through an accusation that went far beyond legitimate questioning of credibility. The jury was fully engaged now, some members nodding, going, along minimally, as if agreeing with Emma's logic. And Emma allowed herself to look directly at him for the first time during the testimony, had completely lost that confident smile, replaced by a tense expression that revealed he realized the strategy wasn't working. Thorne tried to recover, tried to make it seem like he had simply been asking legitimate questions that a defense attorney was obligated to ask. "Ms. Carson, I wasn't suggesting that you deliberately, Mr. Thorne." Emma interrupted him again, and there was something in her confidence now that made it clear the power dynamic had shifted. That she was no longer defensively responding to his attacks, but actively controlling the narrative. "You explicitly suggested I fabricated the kidnapping. Those were your words. And I need the jury to understand that this isn't just about my credibility being attacked. It's about your client trying to escape responsibility for ordering violent acts through lawyers who distort verifiable facts into convenient fictions." Emma turned to make direct eye contact with the jury, something Chen had instructed her to do only at crucial moments when she truly needed them to connect with her humanity. "I survived a real kidnapping. I spent hours genuinely believing I was going to die, that the men in the room with me had specific instructions to execute me. And when Jake risked everything to save me, not because I was his obsession, but because his values dictate that human life matters more than bureaucratic rules, he made a choice that I am honoring by being here today, refusing to be silenced by intimidation tactics." Thorne looked at Castellano, silent communication passing between lawyer and client, which Emma interpreted as an acknowledgement that the line of attack had not only failed, but retreated. It turns out that Emma had used his exaggeration to solidify her own credibility in ways that would be difficult to undo. "I have no more questions," Thorne finally said, returning to the defense table with a posture that attempted to project that he had accomplished his objective, but which any attentive observer would recognize as a tactical retreat from a battlefield he was not winning. Prosecutor Chen stood up for a re-examination, a chance to ask additional questions that would clarify any confusion that cross-examination had created. But when she looked at Emma, there was satisfaction in her eyes that communicated that re-examination was hardly necessary because Emma had done the work of establishing credibility through the strength of her own answers. "Ms. Carson," Chen said, "just a clarifying question. Do you love Sheriff Mercer?" "Yes," Emma replied without hesitation. "Completely." "And does this love compromise her ability to honestly testify about what she observed in the alley on September 15th, about the threats she received, about the kidnapping she survived?" "No," Emma said with equal certainty. "Love doesn't blind one to facts, Mr. Chen. It makes you invested in protecting the truth, because truth is the foundation of everything you've built with the person you love. I love Jake, and precisely because I love him, I won't lie or distort or fabricate in ways that would eventually undermine the trust we've built. My testimony about Mr. Castellano's crimes is based on what I saw and experienced, not on loyalty to Jake." Chen nodded, satisfied. "No more questions. Comment below. True love demands absolute honesty, not blind loyalty." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Emma's final answer, that statement that true love demands absolute honesty instead of blind loyalty, wasn't just a well-constructed line to conclude her testimony in an impactful way. It was a revelation of a fundamental transformation that had occurred not only in Emma, but in how her relationship with Jake had evolved. From a dynamic where he protected and she was protected, to a partnership where both protected truth above convenience, where the integrity of what they had built mattered more than individual tactical results. And behind that evolution was the impact of conscious decisions they had both made about the kind of love they wanted to cultivate. Not love that demanded conformity, but love that celebrated autonomy, even when it complicated everything. For the first time during the entire hearing, through hours of testimony where Castellano had maintained a mask of aristocratic confidence, where he had projected certainty that expensive lawyers and sophisticated legal strategies would guarantee a favorable outcome. Emma saw his composure crack in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Not a dramatic collapse that would be too obvious and potentially generate sympathy, but a controlled erosion of the facade that revealed genuine concern underneath. Castellano leaned toward Thorne immediately after Chen announced he had no more questions, whispering something urgently. That made the lawyer nod in a way that conveyed reassurance, even though Thorne's body language suggested he himself wasn't entirely confident. And the expression on Castellano's face, as he walked away from that whispered conversation, revealed a truth he probably hadn't fully anticipated: that he had underestimated Emma Carson in fundamental ways. Castellano clearly hadn't expected Emma to be so strong under pressure, so willing to actively fight back, rather than be intimidated into contradictions through sophisticated psychological techniques that Thorne had successfully used against dozens of previous witnesses. He had expected, probably based on private investigators' assessments of the trauma Emma had experienced, of her apparent vulnerability, that a witness could be broken, or at least undermined enough, to create reasonable doubt. But Emma had proven to be something entirely different. A witness who had processed trauma, instead of being paralyzed by it, who had transformed vulnerability into strength through understanding her own reactions, who knew the difference between accepting necessary protection and allowing herself to be controlled. And that distinction, that intimate knowledge of her own journey, had made it impossible for Thorne to distort her relationship with Jake into something it wasn't. And when Judge Thompson called for a 15-minute recess, a necessary pause before proceedings could continue with the next phase of the hearing on the left, that witness stand, not with relief at having survived, but with the certainty that she had done exactly what she needed to do. Not perfectly, because no human testimony under extreme pressure could be perfect, but authentically, and with a strength that came from a genuine place, rather than a rehearsed performance. Emma had established credibility through the specificity and consistency of her answers. She had defended her relationship with Jake, not by denying complexities or pretending that circumstances were simple, but by articulating exactly how genuine love could coexist with vulnerability, how conscious choice could emerge from a difficult situation. She had made it perfectly clear to the jury that she was not going to be broken by lawyer tactics, that she knew her own truth so deeply that external attacks could not make her question its foundation. Emma left the courtroom and went into the hallway where lawyers and witnesses waited during recesses, and Rebecca Torres immediately approached with an expression that mixed professional relief with genuine admiration. Rebecca, who had seen Emma at her lowest point in storage, who had witnessed her journey over weeks, who fully understood how much that testimony had cost her emotionally, even though it had been tactically successful. "You were amazing in there," Rebecca said, keeping her voice low because others were waiting in the hallway and conversations could be heard, but with an intensity that conveyed it wasn't just polite formality. Emma, honestly, Thorne expected a frightened victim she could manipulate through technique. She expected to create contradictions by confusing her about chronology or making her defensive about her relationship with Jake. Instead, she got a witness who knows her own truth so completely, who has processed experiences so deeply that she isn't afraid to defend that truth, even when defending it means vulnerable exposure. Rebecca paused, glancing around to make sure no one was listening too closely. "And Emma, when you interrupted Thorne and directly confronted that suggestion about fabricating a kidnapping, that was a turning point. I saw expressions on the jury's faces. They weren't just listening to the testimony objectively anymore. They were connecting with you emotionally. They believe in you in ways that will be very difficult for Thorne to undo." Emma felt waves of relief and exhaustion hitting her simultaneously. "I don't know how Jake does it," she admitted, referring to the years Jake had spent testifying in court as an officer. Being under such scrutiny, having every word weighed and analyzed. Knowing that a wrong hesitation could be interpreted as a sign of dishonesty, it's exhausting in ways I didn't fully anticipate, even with preparation. It's exhausting because you care, Rebecca said gently. Because this matters not just tactically, but personally. And Emma, that care, that investment, was visible in good ways. The jury saw a real person with real stakes instead of a witness reciting a script. Prosecutor Chen then approached, having just finished a conversation with assistants about next procedural steps. "Ms. Carson," she said formally because they were still in a professional setting. But there was warmth in her tone. "Excellent work. You established credibility in ways that far exceeded our expectations. When we return, I will motion for the judge to allow your testimony to remain on record without qualifications. Based on reactions I've seen, I believe Thompson will agree." Chen paused. "And Emma, I know it was difficult having your relationship with Jake dissected publicly like that, but the way you articulated the difference between dependence and genuine love, between accepting protection and being controlled, that was powerful, not only for this case, but potentially for Jake's defense as well. Because it demonstrated that you have clear agency, that the choices you made were informed, rather than coerced." Emma nodded, processing the implications. If her testimony had established that her relationship with Jake was genuine and not the product of coercion, it undermined one of the main arguments that prosecutor Sandra Chen was considering using against Jake, that he had abused his position to create dependency. But prosecutor Chen and Jake's lawyer Chen were not related, so that happy coordination was accidental rather than planned. "How long until we get back?" Emma asked, feeling a sudden need for a moment alone to process everything that had happened. 10 minutes, Rebecca replied, checking her watch. "There's a private room over there where witnesses can wait if you want time to focus before the judge's decision." Emma nodded gratefully and went to the designated room, a small, functional space with a few chairs and nothing else, but offering the privacy she needed. She sat down and allowed herself a moment to truly feel the weight of what she had just done, of how she had exposed more vulnerable aspects of herself and her relationship with Jake for public scrutiny. And then she allowed herself to think about Jake, probably at home right now, obsessing over how the testimony had gone. Unable to be present but desperate for an update, Emma pulled out her phone, seeing that she had a text message from him sent 15 minutes ago. "I know you're still in court, but when you can, let me know you're okay. Love you." Emma typed a quick reply. "I survived. More. Then that's how I think I won. I love you too. I'll tell you all about it later. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter." Because Judge Thompson's decision to allow Emma's testimony to remain on record, but with instructions to the jury to consider her relationship with Jake, was not merely a technicality. It was recognition that Emma had demonstrated through specificity and consistency that she was a reliable witness despite the complication. And behind that decision was the impact that Emma's performance had on how future decisions about Jake would be shaped. 2 hours later, when the hearing finally ended, after further arguments about instructions the jury should receive, and after careful deliberation by Thompson, Emma heard a decision that was a qualified victory. Testimony would be allowed, but the jury would be instructed to consider relationship as a potential factor affecting credibility. Ms. Carson demonstrated through detailed and consistent testimony that she has a clear memory of events, Thompson had said. Her relationship with Sheriff Mercer is relevant, and a jury should be aware of it. But it is not disqualifying. A jury can weigh that factor when making determinations about credibility. Emma left the courthouse after thanking Chen and Rebecca, and when she pushed through the heavy doors into the light outside, the first thing she registered was a familiar figure standing on the sidewalk. Jake was there. He hadn't been able to be inside, but he had waited every minute of that 3-hour hearing, refusing to leave until he knew the result. When he saw Emma emerging, his expression changed from worry to profound relief. "How was it?" Jake asked as he approached, his hands going to her shoulders. Emma How was it? I survived, Emma said. More than that tie, think I won. Thompson left his testimony on record. Chun thinks the jury believed me. Jake pulled her into a hug right there, not caring who was watching. I knew you could do it. Emma, you're stronger than anyone expected. Emma allowed herself a moment to absorb the embrace, to let the tension drain. But then something caught her attention, peripheral movement. She stepped back enough to look, and saw Castellano standing on the other side of the street, maybe 50 feet away. He wasn't doing anything obviously threatening, but he also wasn't hiding the fact that he was observing. His calculated interest conveyed that, even though witness testimony was permitted, he wasn't finished fighting. Jake, Emma said softly, nodding in that direction. 3 o'clock. Jake looked, his body tensing, making sure we know he's watching. Emma felt a familiar fear trying to crawl back, but she also felt determination. I won't let him intimidate me. Not after defending the truth for 3 hours. Castellano can observe, but it doesn't change that the jury will hear testimony. Jake nodded with visible pride. Then let's go. Rebecca is coordinating protection. And Emma. We need to talk about settling the matter now that the testimony is over. Emma knew the conversation was coming, whether Jake should accept 3 years or risk a trial. And her performance had complicated calculations in ways she hadn't anticipated. If Castellano's jury believed me, Emma said as they walked, perhaps the jury in your case would also see strength of character. Maybe, Jake admitted. Or maybe his jury believes you because you're a clear victim. But, in my case, the jury will be judging an officer who broke the law. The dynamics are different. It was a conversation they needed to have in depth. But, as they walked with Castellano watching, Emma understood that strength didn't come from never being afraid, but from acting despite it. That she had discovered a courage she didn't know she possessed. Courage that came from knowing Jake was after her, that love was worth fighting for, and that silence was more dangerous than the truth. Comment below. Partial victories sometimes make difficult decisions more urgent. And as Jake and Emma walked to the car with Castellano, still watching from a distance, his presence a reminder that danger hadn't ended just because a battle had been won. Nima held Jake's hand tightly, communicating everything words couldn't. That she had faced the toughest test yet, and had emerged, not broken but strengthened. That their love had survived public scrutiny and attacks from lawyers, and systematic attempts to twist it into something it wasn't. That she was ready for the next phase of this journey, whatever form it might take. Let's go home, Jake said softly as they reached the car. We'll talk to Marcus about a settlement. We'll process what happened today. And we'll decide together which path to take. Emma nodded, feeling exhaustion finally setting in now that the adrenaline from witnessing was draining. Together, she repeated, like it always should have been. And as Jake drove away from the courthouse, Emma glanced in the rearview mirror one last time and saw Castellano still standing there watching. But instead of feeling the paralyzing fear she would have felt months ago, she felt cold determination. He had tried to silence her through threats, through kidnapping, through expensive lawyers. And each time, she had refused to be silenced. Because sometimes the most important strength doesn't come from being invulnerable, but from choosing to stand up every time the system tries to bring you down. And Emma Carson had stood up today not as a victim, begging for pity, but as a woman who knew her own truth and wasn't afraid to defend it, even when the cost was the brutal exposure of her most vulnerable moments. Look, if this kind of story resonates with you understand that true strength isn't tested in easy moments. But when you have to sit in front of people who want to destroy your credibility and defend the truth with everything you have, if you recognize that moment of discovering you're stronger than anyone expected, including yourself, subscribing to this channel is the way to continue walking this path with me. Because Jake and Emma still have to make a decision about an agreement that will determine the coming years. They still have Castellano's trial, where everything Emma witnessed will be tested again. And they still have to discover if love built on trauma can create a future worth all the sacrifices. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I need to know if you're as invested as I am. If you felt that moment when Emma interrupted Thorne and refused to let the lie go unchallenged. If you understood why Jake's presence, even in his physical absence, made a difference. If you believe that witnessing the truth, even when terrified, is the kind of courage the world needs. And if this touched you in any way, you felt your heart race when Emma looked directly at Castellano and refused to be intimidated. If you recognized that transformation from surviving to actively fighting, if you understood that love that demands absolute honesty instead of blind loyalty is love worth preserving, live alike, so I know. It's you telling me that these stories about finding strength by facing exactly what terrifies you really resonate. There's a video over here that continues part 10, the final emotional conclusion of the season. She opens up. He promises protection, not out of duty, but out of love. Click and follow along there. The story doesn't end here. The most important decision still needs to be made. And you won't want to miss the moment when everything you've built is put to the test. See you soon.